Rick, you're really the one who should start this off, since you're a lot older than I am and wiser.
Older, at least.
Yeah. You went to the University of Chicago. You've been in an environment sort of off the reservation, as it were. How important is it, do you think, for aspiring evangelical scholars to spend some time in the secular academy?
I think it's absolutely vital. You know, there's been this renaissance, we call it, of evangelical scholarship. Some of it deeply compromised, but some of it quite faithful. In the emergence of the neo-evangelical movement in the 50s, they were all the key leaders had been trained at Harvard or at Chicago or at Princeton, and then for a host of institutional reasons, that became suspicious. And I think now in the last generation or so, we've realized the cost of avoiding bumping into the great institutions. There surely are dangers, but those gifted and called ought to be there. And I think we see some fruits of that, fruits even in your own work, that we become less parochial, less insular, and therefore more solidified longer term. I mean, what's your impression of those who have been trained at the elite universities? What are the dangers in your mind? What are the opportunities?
I've seen both. I've seen people who are maybe a little bit weak in their faith go in and get chewed up and spit out and really come out unbelievers. But I've also seen people go in who had a good foundation and became much more thoughtful Christians, and were able to articulate their faith beneath the level of buzzwords and slogans and so forth. So I've seen both, and the key difference, as I look at some of those examples, the key difference, it seems to me, was always the church.
Yeah.
If people could get connected with a good church, they could go almost anywhere and not just survive, but thrive. Is
right. So that the vocation isn't owned by the guild, owned by the academy. Right. So there is something both at stake in what they do with these ideas, where they lead and how they arrive at their conclusions, but also any discipline, but especially the theological disciplines, are social in nature. You take clues from a certain community, and the question is, which community you take your fundamental clues from the history of Christian reflection, grounded in a local church, or from this autonomous body of intellectuals who in part don't have anything at stake other than trying to do something nobody else has done before them, which leads to kind of unnecessary innovations.
And the orthodoxy of the guild they're a part of.
Right. And the key virtues which Christians must learn to bump into of tolerance of everything except those with convictions. And so learning to grapple with those environmental issues of the discipline before they get there is pretty key. And so if theology ought to take doubts seriously, you ought to be careful as a young scholar not simply to think you can face doubts later, that is, during your doctoral studies. Face them early, understand that the church across 2 millennium has wrestled with all the interesting questions, and surely we must wrestle afresh in our generation. But the wisdom of the ages often manifest in a local community, a church, makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I've even seen people go to Christian colleges where they kind of let their guard down and they that's where they learn to stop going to church, because the Christian college was their church.
Becomes everything.
So it can be, faith can be undermined anywhere,
in
it?
in any direction. No, and understanding how you do theology, that is how you train somebody to be prepared for doctoral studies, is always a tricky business, isn't it? Yeah. There are some that are called and gifted, some that feel like they ought to go there because that there's a certain prestige attached to it, though they're not ready, and others who just aren't called or gifted. And discerning that early is pretty important.
A very old question, but we're really struggling with it today with the polarization between the academy and the church. Why on earth would a thoughtful Christian feel any need to go to a secular university to do any kind of graduate work, especially if he or she is engaged in biblical studies, wants to teach the scriptures? Sure. What's the benefit? What's the point?
I think the point is, with all the dangers we've noted already, there is a kind of rigor in the training at a secular academy required of those with deep theological convictions that they might not get elsewhere. And the
You're
rigor,
going to get more pushback.
Going to get more pushback, and thereby also more carefully think through your own general theological framework. Now, rigor can also become a virtue with attendant dangers. It becomes all-encompassing and not merely a means to another end. So, in your own work, why take seriously those you disagree with? Why take seriously those, whether they be genuinely secular folk without religious convictions, or those of very different religious persuasions?
And I would say, in part, because I don't disagree with them about everything. Okay. And there is common grace, and also, even where I do disagree, I have to at least get them right. And I think sometimes in our scholarship, and it's a tendency I've seen in my own work sometimes. You want to go out with a full head of steam, and you want to plant the Christian flag until you've really stated the position that you're criticizing, and recognize the power, the persuasiveness of that position for many people who find it compelling. Then you're really not prepared to make good arguments, persuasive arguments for the Christian faith.
Right.
And that's what Peter calls us to be ready to have an answer for everyone who asks us for the hope that we have.
Right.